So I know I just dropped that message in the chat for you. The time is 2 o'clock and we will go ahead and get started. Definitely appreciate each and every one of you joining with us today. I'm Desmond Martin. I'm one of the program coordinators at NextWave STEM. And it is my pleasure today to welcome you to how to teach STEM in a culturally responsive manner. Doing a little bit something different because the face that you see actually is our program manager, Segundi Chigani. She's been in the classroom since 2012. She's been integral to the work we do at NextWave STEM with regards to managing our pool of instructors and making sure that we are responsive in the way that we work with our students, especially here in the Chicagoland area. Just as a heads up for some of us who have just joined, we get questions about the PD hours. The certificate that has the PD hours credit will be sent out after today's webinar. But if you have any questions or comments or funny commentary that you would love to add, the chat is open and so is the Q&A functionality. At this point, I will turn it over to Segundi and you can go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Des. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you perfectly.
Good. Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. Typically, if you have worked with us before on webinars, you'll notice that it's a little bit more content heavy in terms of a specific tech content or tech capability. But as Desmond's saying, we are expanding a little bit into an area that I think we're all interested in given the current condition. So thank you again for joining us. Super excited to have you all here. The chat is open this whole time and I'll be checking it. Desmond will be checking it. So if you have comments, questions, drop them in. Like Desmond said, I have experience as a classroom teacher. And so I will be also asking you to participate. And I'm actually seeing a bunch of names I recognize here. So thank you all once again for joining me. All right, let's jump right in. So there are a couple slides I want to go over with you first in terms of what the definition of all of this means. So I'm going to quickly pan over here. NextWave STEM. So we are a Chicago-based startup, been around for a couple of years, and our philosophy is that the world needs young innovators. So what we do is that we have hands-on activities, workshops, curriculum, which helps give students confidence to express their creativity and learn how to fail without fear. And recently there's been this term that's been circulating a lot, at least through my networks, which is called failing forward, which is that every time you fail in this direction, it is actually really good for you because you're picking up something that is helping you gain expertise and confidence so that you can do something else. And so it's all about building that confidence, giving them a very safe space in order to be able to do that. And our goal overall is to empower teachers, just like yourselves, just like me, of today to prepare students for the future. So our hope is that as people work with us and as teachers and students learn alongside with us on how to bring STEM into the classroom, that this will actually lead to something beyond their current state. It'll lead to some sort of post-secondary success in terms of STEM. Okay, and then a quick recap on our goals. I know that when you signed up for our webinar, you will have seen these goals, but quick recap here. Two main goals. The first is that we are going to learn how to understand and look for the different cultural contexts that students might experience STEM learning. And the second is to explore techniques that we can use as educators to leverage these student contexts. The goal for that is engaging STEM learning. So we'll go into a little bit of that theory and also in practice to get this going. All right, I was just seeing that people are introducing themselves in the chat. This is awesome. All right, what is culturally responsive teaching? Let me use this as a way to engage some of our participants here. I'm going to look to you, everyone who's here, to drop some comments, some responses in the chat of what you think this is. In many cases, you may already know what this is. I would love to get some thoughts in terms of anything you might know around cultural responsiveness. Another way people talk about this is culturally relevant teaching, culturally sensitive teaching. There's a lot of different terms that are thrown around that kind of talk about similar element. Okay, let me give you maybe 20, 30 seconds here to think of something. All right, I'm seeing a response from Hartsburg, MDen number 21, considering the cultural context and impact of what and how we're teaching. Brittany says, it is teaching in a manner that's tailored to your target audience. These are fantastic answers and insights into essentially what we're talking about here, which is how are you reading your audience? First of all, are you taking the care and the time to get to know your audience, your students, considering the culture that they're coming from, considering the background that they have, and bringing that into your classroom? Excellent. Awesome. Thanks to both of you. All right. So here is a sort of comprehensive definition based on a bunch of research that we've done in NextWave STEM, based on some of the master's coursework that I've done to learn a little bit more what this means. So it's pedagogy, which is a way of teaching that both recognizes and values the inclusion of students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. We're going to get into what cultural references means a little bit more, but it's a way of teaching and learning that brings the student into your curriculum, brings the student into your lesson. Your lesson is not a standalone thing. As many of us who are educators know, your lessons and your curriculum grow along with the students, right? In culturally responsive teaching, instruction has to do two basic things. The first is that it has to build on students' prior knowledge. And the second is that it has to reflect their individual and cultural experiences. So the piece about building on students' prior knowledge, we all know that when a student walks into the classroom, they come with their own set of learnings, their own set of experiences. They come to us sometimes with years and years of teaching, right? If we work with a 13 or 14-year-old, they've been in an education system, at that point, 8 to 10 years, depending on when they started formal schooling. So they're coming in with a lot of that institutional knowledge, but they're also coming in with a lot of things that they've learned outside the school system. So it's a lot that they're bringing in. We have to remember that when they walk through the door, they are not blank slates. People do like to talk about students as blank slates, but we have to remember that they really are not, right? They come with everything that they know as well. The second piece about reflecting individual and cultural experiences, this is where we as teachers need to kind of take a step back and try to understand, where is the student coming from? What have they brought in with them? What are their individual experiences? And this is an area that I think teachers have, while we always have room to grow. I know that I sort of walked into the classroom with my own assumptions based on what my students looked like or based on the languages that I sort of thought they spoke. And so this is definitely an area where there could be a lot of that learning. What this really comes down to is that if we truly value our students, it is our responsibility to bring their lived experience into our classroom, right? This may sound a little fuzzy, but we'll get into a little bit of the science behind why this specifically is important. All right. And then I know I referenced this in my previous slide about students' individual and cultural references, but this can mean a lot of things. It can mean their country of origin. In the US, increasingly, we have students who are of immigrant status. So the country, the culture that they bring into the classroom it can be a very big part of who they are. It can mean the setting in which they live. Are they from an urban setting, a city, suburb, or rural setting? Where does your school reside? That can be a factor. Race, so this is what we are born with. Ethnicity is typically the culture that your student may take on, even though they may not be born into that specific race. So race and ethnicity don't always work together, and that's something that we have to keep in mind as well. Languages spoken. If there are other languages spoken outside of the school, in their house, in their extended family, that can have a huge impact on how they may express themselves or how they may or may not defer to the teacher as an authority figure in the classroom, if that's how they think a teacher operates. Socioeconomic status, this is a big one. NextWave STEM is based in Chicago. We see all sorts of different kinds of iterations based on everything we've talked about. Socioeconomic is definitely a big one. Physical ability. So what we mean by this is able-bodied versus all other sorts of abilities physically, right? In every school, you will find students of differing abilities. And so when you're bringing in references or examples, you want to make sure that it's actually relevant to them. Same thing with learning ability. Everyone operates on a spectrum. So we want to make sure that we are cognizant of what our students bring into the classroom with them. Generation. So this is one that I think is coming up a little bit more intently for people, depending on where you might position yourself on the spectrum of generation. So if you are used to working with students who are a little bit older, so let's say they're high school or college age, and you are a younger teacher, they may not be as much of a generational gap, so to speak. But if you are from Gen Y or Gen X, and you are now working with Gen Z, which are the people who are kind of student age right now, right? Anywhere from 8 to about 20 is kind of what that's considered. There could be some pretty big gaps because these are the ones that grew up, you know, with the internet, with technology. And so if you have an example talking about a phone, which has a cord, right? Like a long cord that connects to your room all the way to the living room, they're going to have to watch some older movies possibly to understand what that's about, right? So it's all about setting up the context for them so they get it. So we have to sort of turn off our assumptions about what students might know. And the generation element is a big one that can come into play as well. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit to why is this important? Okay, so there is a lot of science that backs up why cultural responsive teaching is important. As I was doing research for this presentation, I was able to find the source that talks about the neuroscience behind it. And I do have the reference for that book. So if anyone is interested in going real deep into this and reading about the actual study that was conducted from that neuroscience approach, by all means, please go into it. For the purposes of today's presentation, I'm just going to talk about that a little bit so that we're setting up the context for why are we even talking about this in the first place. Okay, so when our brain encounters information, especially when we're doing things like reading, learning, writing, our brains are constantly searching to make those connections. Our brain is trying to make connections between what is personally relevant, what's personally meaningful, what do we know from the past, and what's relevant and meaningful to an individual is always based in their cultural frame of reference. So if there's an example that's thrown into a novel that you're reading that you can't really connect with, you don't really retain that information. It's harder. It takes a little more work to get there. And it's not like it's impossible. It just takes an extra step or two for people to get there and for them to make those connections. Furthermore, finding cultural relevance and personal connection gives us perspective, engages our attention, assists us in interpreting and inferring meaning. And this is what enables this depth of understanding and interest. It also leads to these high intellectual processing acts, so conceptualizing, reasoning, theorizing. This all links back to Bloom's taxonomy in terms of how do we interpret and understand things as learners and as educators. And so there is a ton of research around why cultural relevance matters. Dr. Yvette Jackson, who is the CEO of the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education, this is out of Columbia University. She writes a foreword to this book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. So like I said, if you're interested in really diving into this, reading about the case studies, reading about the research, definitely encourage you, get a quick screenshot of this. Or wait until we send you the slides and you can go back to this. But the reason I wanted to talk about the theory behind culturally responsive teaching is because if we don't understand why this is important, we're going to start to second guess, why are we even doing this, right? Why are we taking this huge effort of getting to know our students on this much deeper level if we can't understand why it's important? And presumably many of you are here on this webinar with us today because you understand the importance of this. But I find it helpful for myself to be reminded once in a while of the science and the facts behind certain ways of thinking so that it's even more compelling as we move forward. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. And, oh, yes, Desmond has confirmed We will be linking to the recording and material for the presentation and the follow-up email. So yes, you'll have all of this with you, which is fantastic. Okay, I also wanted to take this opportunity to talk about equity. And the reason for this is because we acknowledge that culturally responsive teaching works very much hand in hand with equity. And this is because when we talk about equity, we are talking about creating the conditions for every student to learn in the way that is most meaningful and best and most useful for themselves. And so culturally responsive teaching, if we are doing it correctly, works hand in hand with that, right? And we want to commend you and acknowledge you for taking the time and mental energy to be part of this conversation, because thinking through these topics can be heavy and it can be intense, but we know that this will only make us more effective as we interface with our students. And we want our students to have everything that they can and more. This equity curve is a framework that comes out of the Chicago Public Schools Equity Framework. Just want to go over the different elements of this because it, like I said, it does work very hand in hand with culturally responsive teaching. So the C, so CURVE stands for the curve. The C is being curious, right? You're withholding judgment of, in this context, it's equity, but we're also withholding judgment of how culturally responsive teaching may or may not work with certain students. We're trying to gain a better understanding of the issue. The U is urgency. We have to work with a sense of urgency when we work with our students. NextWave STEM, we operate in Chicago, and so we are in schools kind of all across the city. We know that there's urgency in every school that we work at. And so we want to continue to think about that and make sure that our students are getting the best that they can in a timely way from us. Resiliency. So the work of culturally responsive teaching, culturally sensitive teaching, equity, it can be a lot mentally. We need to all build the resilience to be able to sustain the energy and to continue to be able to push ourselves in this way. Vulnerability, this is a big one. And personally, this is probably the biggest one for me. I think figuring out what your own biases are, what your own assumptions are, kind of challenging yourself in that way and pushing back on that. I think that can really lead to, better teaching and learning, being that person for your students to be able to also open up to. So vulnerability plays out in different ways, especially when we're talking about our own assumptions and stuff like that. I think that becomes very, very important. All right, empathy. So building connection, showing empathy, extremely important. I cannot stress the importance of not sympathy, right, but empathy, of trying to understand where that person is coming from, where students are coming from, and building that into your curriculum. So just want you to keep this in mind. This is a great framework. And at NextWave STEM, we continue to have discussions around equity. We use Chicago Public Schools Equity Framework to guide some of those discussions. So if anyone has any questions for us about how to move these conversations forward within their organizations, we are certainly not the experts in these discussions, but we have created a framework to sort of get to a place where we can have a conversation. So we're happy to work with you to bounce ideas off if that's of interest to you as well. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go in a little bit into how we as educators can start to understand their students' cultural context. And as we talked about, cultural context has a lot of different characteristics to it. It can be the specific city, country, state the student is from, whether they're an immigrant, whether they have any sort of physical or ability limitations coming into the classroom, whether they have a certain socioeconomic status that we need to keep in mind. So these are different things that we have at the back of our mind. I wanted to share, actually, let me check the chat real quick. I see something. Oh, Mary. Mary says, thanks for discussing this topic. You are very welcome. Very happy to do it. And I appreciate the engagement. So that's awesome. Okay, so I am actually going to take a quick pause here and ask for some of your thoughts on what culturally responsive teachers might be doing in their classroom. This may be something that you are already doing in your classroom, whether you are a STEM educator or not, but I'd love to hear from you. What are some things that either you are doing or you've seen your colleagues do or you've read about, practices that teachers take in order to be culturally sensitive to their students? Okay, and I'm just gonna hydrate real quick. Yes, Desmond says that teacher might be you. Completely agree. We have one from Hartsburg, Emden, number 21. Read, promote, discuss, lend out, etc. Books that are diverse and inclusive. Absolutely agree. This is a fantastic one. And with the current climate where people are talking about diversity and inclusion a lot more, this is a really big one, right? Representation in books is very important. So when you look around your bookshelves in your classroom, what do the students look like? What are their aspirations, right? In the books and also in front of you. Matching those up is always a good idea. As well as going beyond, what you may know, right? Being able to stock your classroom library with STEM engineers, for example, from all over the country and all over the world could be a very good step in the right direction for students to then see themselves represented in that. Yes. And then Mary says, junk drawer robotics. Mary, I may have. Okay, got it. Junk drawer robotics. One group scaffolded younger kids and the other group just given blank sheet. Okay, Mary, I might need a little bit more from you to be able to break that one down. Shonali, let me see what you're saying here. Facilitate interaction with mentors that reflect students' identities. Yes, fantastic one. So being the connector between the types of mentors that students have, between the types of educators that students can get in front of them, I think that's a really, really great one. Typically speaking, when we think about the way education was set up in the United States, it does follow a mainstream culture where a lot of us may not feel reflected. And so doing that, making sure that that reflection occurs in different ways is very critical. So that can be in terms of the literature. And Mary, thank you for the clarification. Variety of articles to sort, absolutely. And where form follows function. Okay, got it. Yep, now I get it. And so, right, being able to create the representation space for them, I think is extremely critical. In addition to having the space to be able to talk about these things as well, right? I think having that, being able to facilitate those discussions, whether or not you look like your students, is critical. That really points to that vulnerability of being open and able to talk about this. And I think the other thing that really, really helps is where you are sort of allowing students to pick and choose what sort of materials that they interact with. So if you have a library, let's say we have a library of a bunch of STEM innovators, all sorts of backgrounds, you sort of allow the student to pick. That gives them that choice, right? Because we want to also be empathetic to what their choices might be, want to be supportive of that as well. I'm seeing something coming from Tara here. Create space for student voice and value their knowledge and expand ideas of what counts as STEM content. Absolutely, absolutely. For a lot of students as well, they may not notice that they're already doing STEM, right? They may not notice that the experimentation that they've been doing with their aunt or uncle on the weekend actually counts as STEM. Even if it's something as simple as making bubble fluid. This is for probably the much younger set, K-1 sort of set. But that also counts as STEM because it has a test and analysis portion to it. So putting a name to these things so they actually feel like they're part of that conversation is very, very critical. And then there was something else that Tara said, as the teacher be a learner and allow our student to be the teacher and learner. Yes. The really interesting thing too about NextWave STEM is that we have worked with teachers who typically do not teach their students how to 3D print or code a drone or build a robot. And so the way that that manifests itself in the classroom is that the student is learning alongside the teacher who, while they have attended a very intense professional development session with Desmond, they are still not the expert in the classroom. So there's a teaching and learning, which also encourages a lot of conversation. There's this sort of shared vulnerability that occurs across both sides of the classroom, and there's a lot of great exchange of ideas. So I think definitely that's a really good point, and it really falls into this cultural responsive teaching, because when you teach your students something that you've taught, you know, many times, you sort of may not necessarily have the space in your routines to accept a lot of new feedback that actually changes your curriculum, right? If you're walking into your classroom with the same curriculum every year, that's great, as long as you are allowing for that student voice to help you adjust it as you're going through your day-to-day classroom life. All right. Yes, Mary, critical thinking. Absolutely. I love this junk drawer idea where you have a bunch of materials in your drawer and you're assembling things out of it, right? Critical thinking actually falls into one of the 4 C's that we really like to stress. So communication, critical thinking, collaboration, creativity. So all of these kind of fall into that sort of space to allow the student to think of themselves as a builder, as a maker. And then Brittany says, gauging the headspace of my students at the beginning of class. My icebreaker may ask, what are you proud of today? With this question, I am planting the seed of self-awareness and reflection in the student, while also pinpointing how they might receive information. Okay, awesome. This is a really good one because it gets to really who the student is. And, you know, in our classes that we lead, if the icebreakers can be STEM related, that's great. But there is an element of we want to get to know them, right? We want to create that relationship with them. And so getting to something that lets you understand who they are, lets them understand where you're coming from, I think is very, very critical as a first step in building that relationship. Awesome. Y'all have put in some really good comments in this. So this is really setting me up really well for this slide I want to share. So I picked up on about 4 to 5 sort of best practices that culturally responsive teachers tend to do. And I put them in picture format because we all know that everybody learns in different ways. So this is for my visual learners. The first one, top left corner on the slide, which is a person with a question mark kind of on their face. This practice that culturally responsive teachers do is that they first look inside, right? They look inside themselves and question the assumptions and belief that they may have about themselves as a teacher, or about the kind of classroom that they may have, or the students that they may have. This is a very, very difficult one because it requires a lot of self-reflection, which necessarily is in a lot of cases accompanied by sort of self-doubt of, I'm not sure I should have thought that way. An example that comes to me from my first year of teaching is that when I look back on the notes I took about student behavior, I saw that I was really hard on the boys in my class. And this is actually a pretty common thing among new teachers. They tend to be biased towards one gender or another if we were talking about sort of a gender binary situation, right? So in my case, I was looking at it as girls versus boys. And for me, I was harder on the boys, which meant that they were getting more demerits from me. I was not necessarily giving them too many chances. And so I had to really look inside and think, like, why am I so hard on these boys? And so that was a practice that I was bringing into my classroom, which was toxic, obviously, because clearly there was a pattern of behavior here. I had to really step back and examine why that was happening. And that is an essential part of bringing a practice, bringing a teaching style that is culturally responsive. Another practice, so this, I'm going to move on to the picture with these two women. It looks like the student is wearing glasses. They're holding presumably a tablet together. This is all about developing that relationship. So you can only be culturally responsive if you are in touch with what your student brings into the classroom. So teaching is mostly about relationships, right? I think we all know this. And so making the time and effort setting up those best practices to get to know your students is critical. People do this in a lot of different ways, right? If you have students that you've known previously coming back into your classroom, but you realize you don't know a lot about kind of where they come from or their cultural context, it is completely fine as long as you do it in a sensitive and empathetic way to ask them about themselves, right? So a lot of language arts teachers like to start off with opening essays about something about their family, something about their family history. Those are really great ways to kind of get some interest, to get some information. And then Mary has, oh, awesome. Mary, you have some great things. And Des is going to handle your comments, so this is good. A little bit on a roll over here. So let me finish my thought and I will definitely come back to you. Establishing relationships, right? Very, very important. The third thing, which is the I can, that is a person's finger pointing to the sky. It's third graphic over here. This is the belief that all students are successful and are going to continue to succeed. As a teacher, we must have that belief when we walk into the classroom. Doesn't matter where they're from. It doesn't matter what they've brought into the classroom. Whatever it is that they've brought, we must have the belief that it is possible for them to go anywhere they want to go and that we are there merely to support them. Okay, the third graphic, which is the one with the different students on different sorts of devices. This one is all about making sure that you are tailoring your instruction to meet the needs of different groups of students. So what culturally responsive teachers do is that once they have identified their own biases, once they've started to make those relationships with students, once they have the belief that every student is and will continue to be successful, they are now ready to be in the place where they can start to say, okay, for this group of students, this is the example that will work. Or for this group of students, you know, maybe they've already done a bunch of 3D printing. Let's move to 3D scanning. So kind of knowing your students and helping them move forward along with them is extremely critical to being in touch with exactly what they need. And then finally, this graphic with the light bulbs. This one is a reminder for all of us to continue to stay curious. And this can apply to a lot of different elements in the classroom. If a student has made a statement that reflects a different culture, be curious about it, right? I think it's completely acceptable to ask them to elaborate. For those that may not want to elaborate in public, you can always create another setting to ask them to talk about anything that they might want to share, so that you can better understand them and so that you can tailor the classroom experiences to what they know. There's an example I brought up, I think it was with Desmond when we were having an equity group meeting at NextWave STEM. And the example that I brought was about sailboats. So when I took the SAT way back in the day, a lot of what I noticed on the test was talking about maritime activities, sailboats, yachts, and I had never been on one of those before. So I could not even picture what that felt like, looked like. People would talk about boat shoes. That was completely out of my personal experience. And so I had a really hard time with those passages because I couldn't even picture what that looks like. Now, there's no way for me to communicate with an SAT test writer, but if that were a test given to me in a class, right, I may have, you know, if it was today, felt a little bit more comfortable going up to my teacher and saying, okay, I don't know anything about this culture. Can we sort of break it down with me? And, you know, creating that space, I think, for students can be very, very helpful. And this is kind of a funny example that stayed with me, and I love to talk about it. So if we ever talk about this in person, this will probably come up again. Just warning you. Okay, so I'm actually going to take a quick step back. Before we get into what this looks like in STEM, I would love for you to tell me which one of these sort of stands out to you the most of the 5 different sort of elements that we went through. Which one stands out the most? Which one do you think you will work on implementing in your classroom right away? Or which one is the most interesting to you, the most difficult? I want to hear some of your thoughts. Give you like 30 seconds to do that. Charlene, questioning assumptions and beliefs and staying curious. That's such a good one, such a big one. Yeah, that's Yep. And then Mary says, I can. Yes, we must believe in them and in ourselves as well, for sure. Okay, anybody else? Maybe we will. Erica says, I like the bulbs and the way it illustrates experimenting with ideas. Absolutely, yeah, that's actually another great way to look at those bulbs. I was looking at it in terms of curiosity, but that's another good, really good interpretation of experimenting, testing, analyzing, absolutely. Charlene, yep, for sure. These are all sort of linked, right? You can't really have, I mean, you could have one and then try to do culturally responsive teaching with just one, but I think we'll start to notice that we kind of have to have all of them together with sort of equal shares. All right, Brittany says, I see myself implementing the I can element the most. Fantastic, gotta believe. Tiernan says, adapting curriculum to students' individualized experience and needs is something I think is very exciting and important. I totally agree. And I think a lot of this, you sort of have to be able to think on your feet very quickly, right? Once you've set up the conditions that you are ready to do this, that is when things start. So it's when you're in the classroom and you are trying to think through good examples or you're trying to make it relevant. This is when there's a lot of thinking on the feet that is completely required. Yes, Mary, please use these pictures. Yeah, I had a good time finding these and making sure they looked, visually appealing. All right. Awesome, everyone. I really appreciate these comments. Definitely makes my presentation a lot more engaged and fun. Okay, so now I want to share with you a little bit of what culturally responsive teaching might look like specifically in STEM. So we talked about how it looks like, how it would look like for all sorts of disciplines up until now. I know that we've sort of thrown STEM examples in there, but I just want to do a little bit more of a deep dive into STEM. So this is what we did. We went to our experts. So our NextWave STEM instructors are the absolute experts when it comes to teaching drones, 3D printing, robotics, the next STEM way. So I met with each of my teaching colleagues, each of my instructors, and we set up conferences so I could ask them questions, right? So I asked them to tell me a little bit about what culturally responsive teaching looks like in their classroom, how they may have customized NextWave STEM's curriculum for their students, and how they hold their students to the highest standard. And I have to be honest, this third question, I didn't even ask it, but so many examples that were given fell under this question. So now I'm throwing in this additional question of how do we hold our students to the highest standards? Because if we are expecting for them to reveal so much to us about their lives, the least we can do is to continue to uplift them, right? You're giving me this much, I want to give you even more. All right, so I want to go into this. Yeah, special education students as well, absolutely. Okay, let me jump to my next slide. All right, so the way I've laid out the next couple of slides is I have pulled quotes from all of my interviews with our instructional staff. And I've also thrown in pictures of many of them, so I hope you enjoy that visual representation. This first question, what does culturally responsive teaching look like in your classroom? Kind of a big question. One of the first instructors I talked to talked about creativity. So he said, we allow our youth to be creative. If they're working in Tinkercad, we're not going to make it rigid, right? We want to help them be creative. We want to give them some guidelines, but within those guidelines, we want them to feel free to do whatever they want. Tinkercad is a software that's used to design things that you then eventually 3D print. And if you have not taken any 3D printing intro sessions with Desmond, I will point you to where you can sign up for that later because that's a really good one. Okay, one of my other instructors said, I gauge how to present certain information within the first 2 classes. Based on that, I tailor how much to go into definitions. Based on geography, I'll bring in different neighborhood examples. So the method that this instructor uses is the first 2 classes out of our 10 classes is more of what are these students about, right? Where do they come from? So he's doing that research right away, trying to figure out what they bring to the table, how much do they need in terms of the setup, the definition? He must be talking about these very specialized terminology we use in class. He's trying to figure out how much to scaffold that, how much to do that so that it's the most meaningful experience for them. And then based on geography, so based on where they're located within Chicago, he talks about different examples. And I will get to what those examples are in a little bit. Another one of my instructors said, for my students who have the privilege and freedom to speak their minds, I made a system that feels like a game to them. So what this instructor does is they assess where the students are sort of emotionally, sort of mentally, and then she tries to figure out how she can tailor it so that it's most motivating to them. Specific groups of students that she worked with that she was talking to me about was that they felt very privileged to always kind of share their opinion and discuss, and which is fantastic. And so then what she did for them is she said, okay, the way to motivate them is that I'm going to have another sort of social icebreaker activity towards the end of class if they can complete the work now that I need them to complete. For some students, that may not be motivating. They may say, I don't want another icebreaker. Like, I've had enough of these kids. I talk to them all day. But she recognized that for her set of students, that's exactly what they needed. So she was able to build that into her teaching as well. All right, and then I'm gonna move on to my next slide here. I think I saw something in the chat. Give me a second. Oh, okay. Chris says, Chris, the new assistive tech says, at the start of class, I do short sensory integration warm-up and help students summarize what we've done so far. Awesome. Yeah. Doing a warm-up is great. We do a lot of sort of icebreakers, so kind of similar vein to try to get to know them a little bit better, make them feel comfortable, show them that we really care about kind of who they are. And I think this comes back to Brittany's suggestion for an icebreaker earlier of what are you most proud of, right? So that ties that together very nicely. Okay, next, here's the next question. How have you customized NextWave STEM's curriculum for your students? Okay, so there's 2 slides on this because our instructors had a lot to say about this. Here's what a couple of them said. One of them said, at one school, we simulated Amazon delivery using drone technology, versus at another, I wouldn't see Amazon deliver. So why would we go into that simulation, right? If the students are not seeing it, but then we're talking about it, that's just a deficit model of learning. It makes them kind of wonder why they didn't know about that. Of course, talking about the possibility of technology is fantastic. It is beneficial for students to know how Amazon operates, but as an intro example, it has to be a hook that actually helps them understand and activate their prior learning. So starting off with something more familiar is, in our opinion, a much better way to kind of draw them into that class. Another teacher says they did not know how to work open-endedly in Tinkercad. So I said, design your name using these different techniques. Be creative, use colors. Don't just make something real quick and be done with it. Sit and think about design, be intentional. So this teacher operated within Tinkercad, right? And Tinkercad, actually, there's a picture over here next to our instructor, Paul, on this slide. He said, the only guidelines I'm gonna give you for Tinkercad is design your name. You can do it in cursive, you can do it in block letters, you can change the color. That's all I'm saying to you. Everything else is up to you. So you kind of put that in the student's hands, right? By just setting the boundary. That allows them to express themselves. That allows them to bring in whatever it is they want. Some kids might actually design it based on the flag of the country that they feel very close to. And we encourage that, right? We want to see all this sort of creativity and identity come into this as well. Another one of our instructors says, some students in certain schools may have not seen a 3D printer. So I'll bring it in. I'll also show them 3D scanning, where I'll scan a real world object and turn it into mesh, virtual clay, without actually designing an object, which is where without actually designing an object, you 3D print it. So this teacher got very hands-on. As soon as they realized that these students had not seen a 3D printer together, they went and picked up a 3D printer, brought it to the school, and then had this very visual and hands-on element to class. This is what 3D printer looks like. This is how you do it. And then for this set of students as well, they were able to adapt to the 3D printing sort of theory and practice so quickly that then it was, maybe the next thing to show was 3D scanning. So this is where you have these infrared rays, that can sort of quickly design something, and so you don't have to necessarily go through a Tinkercad sort of platform to get to it, but very creative way. I love hearing these stories because it also helps me visualize how the students are interacting with it and visualizing it and having it be a part of their day-to-day learning as well. So I really, really love this example too. Okay, couple more examples. Okay. Talking about our drone class a little bit here. So this teacher says, for example, in the first lesson of drones, we're trying to explain to them what a UAV is, unmanned aerial vehicle. So we speak on the students level. The students understand video games. Also, what this instructor did is that they used examples from current events. So there was a US bombing, talked about drone involvement in that. So that got them interested. Also asking questions about a UAV flies, but do all drones fly? Also bringing back Call of Duty, right? So this is the gaming element that we're bringing in. This is such an indication for me of the element of sort of the generational insight you may need to have in your students so that you can actually talk at their level, right? Because this is something that's a little bit more characteristic, I think, of this generation. This last part, we expanded off of students' knowledge. This is when this teacher said this, I felt like the theory that I had read about, the stuff I had done in the classroom, and then what they were doing kind of all came together, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're expanding off of their knowledge. We're taking their prior knowledge, and then we are helping accelerate their future knowledge by kind of writing on that plane, right? Okay, and this other teacher says, in week 7, the drone was supposed to do a shuttle run. So we had the drone run suicides as opposed to a shuttle run, because the terminology was not familiar to my students. This is another fantastic example of, it's not necessarily the specific examples that you use in class, it could just be the words you use, right? And so being able to explain suicide run versus shuttle run, the objective is exactly the same. You're just having the drone go back and forth, right? But the way you're explaining it is a lot more conducive to the way the students are already speaking. All right, and then I want to see what okay. So this is a little bit of an insight into how we hold our students to the highest standard at NextWave STEM. And like I said earlier, this is not a question that I meant to ask. This is information that came out of the interviews, because this is what our instructors are committed to, right? They truly believe that their students can do it, and so they're gonna make it happen. One instructor said, STEM and STEAM are about intentionality. What do you want to get out of it? What are the takeaways from it that you can bring and say back to me that you took away from the class? So this is direct quotes that I'm taking from the instructor as they're speaking to the students. Another instructor says, I tell my students, here are my expectations, and this is what respect looks like. Honoring these expectations shows me that you respect me. You being able to speak and learn and be who you are is me respecting you. We can tailor to each other's needs. I'm not a strict teacher, but I'm here for a reason. So establishing that level of respect. I mean, this is a vulnerability piece right here, right? Of the teacher is putting themselves out there and saying, this is what I expect from you. What do you expect from me? Let's kind of get there together. This third one is a very, another really good insight I got from speaking to one of my instructors. I tell them, your counterpart. So this is, I believe it was a 6th grade class. So your counterpart 6th graders have already coded a drone, already printed in 3D. How many Black engineers do you know? How many Black doctors do you know? You have an opportunity to work with this and master it and do it well. So this instructor was teaching in a majority Black school, and so she was asking some tough questions of her students, right? She was saying, I know 6th graders in this other school have done this, and I'm not afraid to tell you that this is already happening among 12 and 13-year-olds. Are you helping get yourself there? Are you taking advantage of the opportunity? So she was having a pretty tough conversation with them, and you know, I was asking her how the students reacted, and she said that when she has the talk with some students, sometimes they get really quiet. Some students get very sort of introspective and reflective and then ask really good questions coming out of it. And so there's definitely, you know, there are some difficult conversations that occur, but this is how we hold our students to the highest standards. We're not trying to compare them against different groups. We're just saying this opportunity is now in front of you. You can definitely rise to the challenge. Now let us help you kind of get to where we think you can be, and we think you should want to be as well. I know I said a lot, so I'm going to take a quick breather here and allow everyone to react to what I just shared. Is there anything that resonates with you here? Let's see. Erica says, I think sometimes adults consciously or unconsciously tamp down their students' enjoyment. Learning and fun are supposed to happen simultaneously. I 100% agree with that. And especially if you can activate what the student's already interested in, you can get them to kind of do both without even noticing it, right? I know that there are a lot of students who are into Pokemon, different sorts of things, and there's a lot of robotics and STEM built into that. So that's another channel, right? You just got to get to know your students and then pull it through there. All right, so Desmond threw that question in the chat. Please give us some feedback while I hydrate real quick. Hartsburg, Emden, number 21. Absolutely. I love this comment. They say, I love sharing success stories with students. There are a lot of wonderful books for all ages that are profiles of STEM, STEAM success stories. Absolutely. We talked about sort of building a library of diverse and inclusive authors, creators, makers. I think that's a really great way to get those conversations started, right? And falls right in line with the STEM and STEAM work we're trying to do here. Erica, good question. Erica says, STEM is very material intensive and hands-on. How can we create an atmosphere where kids feel empowered to engage with materials and maybe make a mess? Such a good question. So the way that we set up a lot of our classes is that even before we get into some of the more material intensive elements, we like to start with materials that students may be easily able to find. So for example, and this sort of appeals, will work more for the youngest set. So if you're working with, K to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, one example that we've done that's worked really well is a marble run. So we'll have students bring things of all shapes and sizes, right? So egg cartons, toilet paper rolls, like the center part, cardboard boxes. You kind of design this like marble run taped to a wall. I can actually send you a picture over about this too. But it's all about testing and analyzing and refining the process. So as long as you have a test and testing, analyzing, sort of questioning element to it, that counts as STEM because you are thinking through elements of the design process, allowing kids to redesign things, allowing them, actually encouraging them to make mistakes, because that's really the best way to figure out how to fix something. So that's something that you can do. We have some airplane sort of building activities in our K to 2 classes that don't require a lot of materials. It's kind of things that we have found to be very affordable. So that's another thing we can do. And Erica, we're actually happy to put you in touch too with our partnerships team. They have a lot more sort of tangible examples that they can, I think, get into that kind of fit, whichever age level we're talking about. So it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be, something that really breaks the bank in that way. I think there's a lot of ways to do STEM. So yeah, definitely want to help get that information to you, because I think that could be really helpful. We don't want it to be intimidating for anyone to enter STEM, for sure. Oh, Mary, great suggestion. YouTube has a lot of neat ways to make fan, very simple stuff. I think that's the key, right? We want to keep it, we want to keep this entry sort of barrier free. We don't want people to think that the only way into STEM is if you buy a drone or if you know how to code. Like that's a part of STEM, but that does not have to be how it is. And yes, Desmond has put the name of our school partnership manager, Jared, in there. So we can definitely go a little bit more in depth with you there. Awesome. All right, let me see if I have any other. Oh, yes. So great segue. So thank you to all for your comments and questions about a couple slides that we've been sharing here. Here are some things that we are doing at NextWave STEM that we would love for you to know about so we can connect about this further. So educators that have joined us today, thank you again for joining us. We encourage you to keep learning and looking for new ways to engage with STEM material, engage your students. We do have free PD sessions throughout the rest of the summer. So we are at Tuesday, August 18th. So at least 3 coming up. The next one is how to teach drones remotely, happening next Tuesday. So definitely sign up with us for that. And we would love to continue to talk about this stuff with you. We also have classes, 2 sorts of kinds of classes that we've been operating this summer. So one is a hands-on experience. This is where we have STEM kits that we deliver to the student's home, and then there's live instruction. So our teacher might be building a robot on one end, and the student is building a robot, in their sort of home location. So that's one way to do it. Another way, which we've seen so much success with, is our online experience. So this is where we're not requiring any equipment. In fact, all you need is a laptop. In some cases, it might be a laptop and a phone or some sort of tablet. But you can do Tinkercad. So what this girl is holding up in this picture is designing 3D models within the Tinkercad workspace. So we talk about design thinking. We talk about all the theory behind how to make things happen in STEM. And it's very, very doable online experience and quite hands-on as well. We've had a lot of success with students, typically from the 3rd to 8th grade, working on this as well. All right, and then let's see here, next slide. Yes, so our programs currently, we have, up until the spring, everything was in person. We switched over to remote. We now have all sorts of offerings. So we have the remote option, which is where students will kind of log in on their laptop and work with us online. We have a hybrid option, which is where students can choose to work in person, and then depending on the circumstance, we kind of work remotely or online. And so we have all different ways to customize. As you have already seen, our instructors are very, very immersed in the content and also in the actual learning of our students. And so we're hoping that we can continue to interface with you in a lot of different ways moving forward. Yep, feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat, as I know that you have been doing. And then finally, this is my contact. This is what it looked like pre-pandemic. So very interesting to kind of reflect on your own picture in a little bit. Desmond is also on the chat. And so Desmond, if you want to drop in your email address and contact in the chat, that would be fantastic as well. Oh, Desmond also dropped mine. Thank you so much. Cool. So we have about a minute or so left. So if you have any last minute questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But if not, really, really appreciate everybody for joining us today and for talking to us about teaching in a culturally responsive manner. I definitely enjoyed it. I know I spoke too fast, so please feel free to refer back to the slides and to the recording if you'd like to do that. And we hope that we see you next time on our webinar. So thanks again. Have a good afternoon.